Hey guys, welcome back. So if you're new here, I'm Liz. This is Creating Crime Time, where I'm your host, and I sit down, I talk about a true crime case, and I create something at the same time. So if that piqued your interest, hit that red subscribe button down there, turn your bell notification on to all, that way you know whenever I upload. Let's get into today's true crime case. So today we are finishing up the case of Dean Corll. So I am going to add in footage that I have already recorded for this section, and you'll see different outfit, but that's because I filmed a lot of this case ahead of time in order to make sure that you guys have more content. So with that being said, here is that. Okay, we're talking about Elmer right now. So Elmer later stated that for several months he ignored Dean's offer. However, in early 1972 is when he decided to accept the offer because him and his family were in dire financial crisis. So Elmer said the first abduction he participated in actually occurred during the time Dean lived at 925 Schuler Street, which is an address he moved to in February of 1972. So David later claimed that Elmer became involved in the abductions while Dean resided at the address he had occupied immediately prior to Schuler Street. So there's a little bit of like, you didn't do it then, this was me, you did it here, like between the two boys. So, yeah. If Elmer's statement was believed, the victim was abducted from the Heights in February or in early March of 1972. And in a statement that Elmer gave police following his arrest, this boy in particular stated he and Dean picked up a boy from the corner of 11th and Stoodwood, lured him to Dean's house, and gave him the promise of smoking some marijuana with the pair. So while at the residence, they used a ruse. There was a ruse used with Elmer and Dean, and they made it so that Elmer would cuff his hands behind his back, and he would free himself with a hidden key in his back pocket. So this would then dupe the young guy into trying to do the same thing to see if he can undo the handcuffs that he puts on himself. Well, after he puts himself in the handcuffs, this is when Dean would gag him and bind him. So Elmer then would leave the room, and it would just be the boy and Dean in there. And Elmer believed that this boy would then be sold into a sex slavery ring. The identity of this first victim remains unknown. They don't know yet. So 1 month later, on March 24th of 1972, this is when all three would encounter an 18-year-old acquaintance of Elmer, and his name is Frank Aguirre. And he would be leaving a restaurant on Yale Street, and this is where he worked. So Elmer called Frank over to Dean's van and invited him to drink beer and smoke pot with all three of them at Dean's apartment. So Frank agreed, and he followed the trio to Dean's apartment, but in his own Rambler. So inside Dean's apartment, this is when Frank smoked some pot and with the three of them before picking up a pair of handcuffs that Dean had left on his table. So in response, Dean then pounced straight on Frank, pushed him into the table, and cuffed his hands behind his back. So he just subdued him. So Elmer later claimed that he didn't know what Dean's true intentions were towards Frank when he persuaded his friendship persuaded his friend to accompany them to Dean's house. So, flash forward a little bit to 2010. In an interview that Elmer gave, he claimed that he attempted to persuade Dean to not assault and kill Frank once David and Dean both bound and gagged him. But apparently Dean refused, and he informed Elmer that he had raped, tortured, and killed the previous victim that he assisted in abducting, and that he intended to do the same thing with Frank. And Elmer would assist them in Frank's burial at the High Island beach. So, despite any revelation that Dean was in reality killing these boys, and that David was assisting them, Elmer became an active participant in this madness. And 1 month later, April 20th, they abduct another youth. He was a 17-year-old named Mark Scott. And again, Scott, who knew Elmer and David well, was grabbed by force, and he fought furiously against any attempts by Dean of restraining him, and he even attempted to stab them in a way to get them away. However, this is when Mark saw Elmer pointing a pistol toward him, and according to David, this is when Mark just gave up. Mark would then be tied to the torture board, and he suffered the same fate as Frank. He would be raped, tortured, strangled, and buried at High Island Beach. So, David would later state that Elmer was especially sadistic in his participation of the murders committed at Schuler Street. Before Dean vacated that address on June 26th, this is when Elmer assisted Dean and David in the abduction and murder of two youths. They were named Billy Belk and Johnny DeLome. So in David's confession, he stated that both of them were tied to Dean's bed, and they were, after their torture and rape, this is when Elmer manually strangled Billy and then shouted, "Hey, Johnny!" and shot Johnny DeLome in the forehead. And the bullet would exit through Johnny's ear. Yeah. After he was shot, it didn't kill him. Johnny then pleaded with Elmer, "Henley or Wayne, please don't," before he was strangled. Both of them would be buried at High Island Beach. So, also during the time that Dean lived at Schuler Street, they lured a 19-year-old boy named Billy Rittinger to the house, and Rittinger was again tied to the plywood board, tortured and abused by Dean. So David would later claim that Billy was persuaded of, David later claimed that he persuaded Dean to allow Billy to be released, and Billy was allowed to leave the residence. On another occasion is when Elmer knocked David unconscious as he entered the house. Dean then tied David to his bed and would assaulted him repeatedly before releasing him. And despite the assault, David continued to assist Dean in the abductions of his victims. So I think he continued to help him because he was in love with him. I mean, he knew him as a father figure. Dean also bought a Corvette for him as a gift. And I mean, he's with him all the time. He showers him in gifts. He gives him money. Like, I think he suffered from like Munchausen by proxy due to him not only being like repeatedly attacked by David, but just being in that, what is it, that downward spiral, if you will, of you get sucked in and you're just stuck there. You don't know how to get out, so you just keep continuing to do the same thing over and over again. You know what I mean? Like, he's stuck. There's no way to fix it because he can't get himself out of that. So, yeah. After vacating the Schuler Street residence is when Dean moved to the Westcott Towers, and this was in the summer of 1972. He was known to have killed 2 further victims. The first was a 17-year-old named Stephen Sickman, who was last seen leaving a party held in the Heights shortly before midnight on July 19th. He was savagely bludgeoned and on the chest with a blunt instrument before he was strangled and buried in the boat shed. Approximately about a month later, on or about the 21st of August, a 19-year-old named Roy Bunton was abducted while walking to his job, and he was an assistant at a shoe store in Houston. Bunton was gagged with a section of a Turkish towel and his mouth bound with adhesion tape. He was shot twice in the head, and he was also buried in the boat shed. So neither of these 2 were named by either David or Elmer as being a victim of Dean. Both of them were identified as victims only in 2011. So October 2nd, 1972, Elmer and David encountered 2 Heights teenagers named Wally J. Simoneau and Robert Hembry. So those 2 were walking to Hembry's house. So Simoneau and Hembry were enticed into David's Corvette, and they were driven to Dean's apartment. That evening, Wally was known to have phoned his mom's home, and he shouted the word "mama" into the receiver before the connection was terminated. The following morning, Hembry was accidentally shot in the mouth by Elmer, and the bullet exited through his neck. Several hours later, both of them were strangled to death and subsequently buried in a common grave inside the boat shed, directly above the bodies of James Glass and Danny Yates. So sometime during the following month, an 18-year-old Oak Forest youth was known both to Dean and Dean and Elmer. He was named Willard Branch. He disappeared while hitchhiking from Mount Pleasant to Houston. He was gagged and emasculated and also buried in the boat shed. November 15th, a 19-year-old Heights boy, his name is Richard Kepner. He disappeared on his way to a phone booth, and Richard was strangled and buried at the High Island Beach. So altogether, at least 10 teenagers between the ages of 13 and 19 were murdered between February and November of 1972, and 5 of whom were buried at the High Island Beach and 5 inside the boat shed. January 20th, 1973. Dean yet again moves. He moves to an address on Wirt Road, which is in the Spring Branch district of Houston. Within 2 weeks of moving to this address, he murders again a 17-year-old named Joseph Lyles. Joseph was known to both Dean and David. He lived on Antoine Drive. This is the same street of which David lived on in 1973. So, not even 3 full months later, or 2 full months later, Dean moves yet again on March 7th, and this is when he leaves his Wirt Road apartment and moves to 2020 Lamar Drive, which is an address his dad vacated in Pasadena. So there's no known victims between February 1st and June 4th of 1973. Dean was known to have suffered from hydrocele at this time, or hydrocele, in early 1973, which may have contributed to inactivity at the time. So in addition Around the time of Joseph's murder, Elmer temporarily moved away to Mount Pleasant in an apparent effort to distance himself from Dean. These facts may account for the sudden lull in killings as well, because, I mean, there's like, you're so active and then you drop down. Yeah, so nonetheless, from June, Dean's rate of killings increased dramatically. Like, he had his dull time and then it just like skyrocketed. And the level of brutality increased as well. Especially, this was testified during like criminal charges proceedings with David and Elmer. They spoke that the level of brutality of the murders committed while Dean lived on Lamar Drive like increased. And yeah, Elmer later compared that the acceleration in the frequency of killings and the increase of brutality that was exhibited by Dean toward his victims was likely a bloodlust thing. And he added that Elmer and David would instinctively know when Dean announced that he needed to do a new boy. Due to the fact that he would appear restless, he smoked cigarettes, and he would make reflex movements. So June 4th is when Elmer and Dean abducted a 15-year-old boy named William Ray Lawrence. He was last seen by his father on 31st Street. 3 days after abuse and torture, he would be strangled and be buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Less than 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn was abducted, strangled, and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. So, July 6, 1973, Elmer begins attending classes at the coach's driving school in Bel Air. This is where he becomes acquainted with a 15-year-old named Homer Luis Garcia. The following day, Garcia phoned his mother saying that he was going to spend the night at his friend's house. He would be shot and left to bleed to death in Dean's bathtub before he was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. 5 days later, on the 12th of July, a 17-year-old boy named John Sellers of Orange County was bound and shot to death and buried at High Island Beach. So in July of 1973, David actually marries his pregnant fiancée. I mean, who would have thunk it? He's having a romantic relationship outside of his relationship with Dean and Elmer. Elmer temporarily became the sole procurer of the victims and assisting in the abduction and murder of 3 Heights youths between July 19th and July 25th. Elmer claimed that these 3 abductions were the only 3 that occurred after becoming the sole accomplice of Dean in Brooks, in which David did not participate. One of these victims, 15-year-old Michael Bollock, brother of previous victim Billy Balk, was last seen by his family on July 19th on his way to get a haircut. He was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. The 2 other victims, Charles Cobble and Marty Reed Jones, were abducted together on the afternoon of July 25th. Elmer himself later stated that they were buried. He buried both of their bodies at the boat shed. So, August 3rd, 1973, Dean killed his last victim, which is a 13-year-old boy from South Houston, and his name is James Stanton Dremala. So Dremala was abducted by David and Dean while riding his bike in Pasadena, and they drove him to Lamar Drive on the pretense of collecting empty glass bottles to resell. At Dean's house, Dremala was tied and tortured, raped, and strangled with a cord before being buried in the boat shed. This is when David later described Dremala as a small blonde boy for whom he had bought pizza for, in whose company he had spent about 45 minutes with before he would be attacked. Yeah, so, yeah. So on the evening of the 7th of August of 1973, Elmer, he was 17 at the time, he invited a 19-year-old named Timothy Corll to attend a party at Dean's residence in Pasadena. So Tim, who was a casual acquaintance of Dean's, was the next intended victim, and he accepted the offer to attend a party at Dean's house. So David wasn't present at the time, and the two of them, so Tim and Elmer, arrived at the house, and this is where they sniffed paint fumes and drank alcohol until Tim then drove back to Houston Heights, and Tim parked his vehicle close to Elmer's house. So the two of them then exited the vehicle, and Elmer heard commotion across the street, and this was emanating from a 15-year-old friend's house named Rhonda Williams, and he walked towards her home. Well, Williams, she had sprained her ankle, so she was suffering from that, but she was also beaten by her drunken father that evening, and she accepted Elmer's invitation to join him and Tim at Dean's house. So Rhonda then climbed into the back seat of Tim's Volkswagen, and the trio then drove to Dean's house. So approximately at 3 a.m. on the morning of August 8th, 1973, Elmer and Tim accompanied Rhonda. Then that's when they returned to Dean's house. So Dean was furious that Elmer had brought a girl to his house because, I mean, he only likes boys. And he told Elmer that he ruined everything. This is a private party. Elmer explained that Rhonda had argued with her father that evening, and man, that she didn't wish to return home, so that's why she was with him. Dean appeared to calm down, and then he offered them beer and weed. The three teenagers began smoking and drinking, and then Elmer and Tim were also sniffing paint fumes, and Dean was watching them very intently. Approximately 2 hours later, Elmer, Tim, and Rhonda all passed out. So Tim awoke to find himself lying on his stomach and Dean snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. His mouth was taped shut, his ankles were bound with nylon rope, and he was gagged with adhesive tape, lying face down on the floor. Tim was also stripped naked. Yeah. So I bet you guys can guess what happens next. So Dean then notices that Tim has woken up. He removes the gag from his mouth, and Tim protests against Dean's actions, and Dean reiterates that he was angry with Elmer for bringing a girl into his house, and that he was going to kill all three of them after he had assaulted and tortured Tim, initially stating, "Man, you blew it bringing that girl," before shouting again, "I'm gonna kill you all, but first I'm gonna have my fun." He then repeatedly kicked Rhonda in the chest before lifting Elmer to his feet, dragging him into his kitchen, and placing a .22 caliber against his stomach, threatening to shoot him. Well, Elmer calmed Dean down, and he promised to participate in the torture and murder of both Williams and Tim if Dean released him. So approximately about 30 minutes later, Dean agreed to untie Elmer and then carried Tim and Rhonda into his bedroom, tied them on opposite sides of the torture board, Tim on his stomach and Williams on her back. He then handed Elmer a hunting knife and ordered him to cut away Rhonda's clothes, insisting that while he would rape and kill Tim, Elmer would do the same thing to Rhonda. So Elmer began cutting away Rhonda's clothes as Dean undressed and began to assault and torture Tim. Both Tim and Rhonda had awakened at this point, and Tim began shouting and writhing around as Rhonda, whose gag Elmer had removed, lifted her head and asked Elmer, "Is this for real?" And Elmer stated yes. Rhonda then asked him, "Are you going to do anything about it?" Elmer then asked Dean whether he might take Rhonda into another room. Dean ignored him, and Elmer then grabbed Dean's pistol, shouting, "You've gone far enough, Dean." This is when Dean got off of Tim, and this is when the true madness unfolds. True madness. Dean's livelihood of killing and torturing these men is done. Elmer's had enough, and verbatim, this is what he says: "I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Dean approached Elmer saying, "Kill me, Wayne." Elmer says, "I can't any longer. Can't have you kill all my friends." Dean gets in his face and says, "Kill me, Wayne." So this is when Elmer steps back a few steps, and he fires at Dean, and he shoots him in the forehead. The bullet failed to fully penetrate Dean's skull though. So Dean continued to lurch towards Elmer. This is when Elmer fired 2 more rounds, and they would hit Dean's left shoulder. Dean then ran out of the room. He hit a wall in the hallway and slid down the wall in the hallway outside of the room where the other 2 teenagers were bound. So where Tim and Rhonda were. Dean died where he fell, and his naked body would be lying face towards the wall. Elmer later would recall that now he's shot Dean, the sole thought in his mind in the moments immediately afterward was that Dean would have been proud of the way that he behaved during the confrontation, adding that he had been training him to react quickly and forcefully, and that this is exactly what he would have done. So after he shot Dean, Elmer released Tim and Rhonda from their torture boards. All 3 of them dressed. They discussed what actions they should take. Elmer suggested that Tim and Rhonda should simply leave, and Tim said, "No, we should call the police." So this is when Elmer agreed, and he looked up the Pasadena Police Department in Dean's telephone directory. So 8:24 a.m. on August 8th, 1973, Elmer calls the police department, and his call was answered by an operator named Velma Lines. In this call is when Elmer basically spewed out, "Y'all better come here. I just killed a man." Elmer gave the address. The operator was quick to confirm 2020 Lamar Drive in Pasadena. As Tim and Rhonda and Elmer waited on Dean's porch for the police to arrive, Elmer mentioned to Tim that he had done that, killed by shooting 4 to 5 times. Minutes later, a Pasadena police car arrived at the location, and they were sitting on the porch. of the house. The officer noted that there was also a .22 caliber pistol in the driveway near them. Elmer told the officer that he was the individual that made the call and indicated that Dean's body was inside the house. After confiscating the pistol, this is when they placed Elmer, Rhonda, and Tim inside of the patrol car. The officer then entered the bungalow and they would discover Dean's body in the hallway. So the officer returned to the car and read Elmer his Miranda rights. And in response, Elmer said, "I don't care who knows about it, I have to get it off my chest." Tim later told detectives that before the police officer had arrived at Lamar Drive, Henley or Elmer had informed him, "If he wasn't my friend, I could have gotten $200 for you." So while in custody, Elmer initially was questioned in relation to the killing of Dean. He recounted of events of the previous evening and morning, explaining that he had shot Dean in self-defense. The statements given by Tim and Rhonda corroborated Elmer's account, that the detective questioned Elmer, believing he had indeed acted in self-defense. So when questioned regarding his claim that Dean threatened him and that morning he had shouted that he had killed several boys, Elmer explained that for almost 3 years, him and David helped get teenage boys, some of whom had been their own friends, for Dean, for him to rape and murder. Elmer gave a verbal statement stating he initially believed that the boys were being abducted and sold into a sexual slave ring, and that this was based out of Dallas. But soon he learned that Dean was killing them himself, and with all the victims that they were giving him. Elmer admitted that he assisted Dean in several abductions and murders, and that he had actively participated in the torture and mutilation of 6 or 8 victims prior to their murder. Most of the victims were buried at the Southwest Houston boat shed, and others buried at Lake Sam, Rayburn, and High Island Beach. Dean had paid up to $200 for each victim he or David was able to lure to his apartment. So police were initially super skeptical of his claims, and they assumed that the sole homicide case was that of Dean, as they had been ascribed as being the result of a drug-fueled fistcuff that had turned deadly. Elmer was quite insistent, however, upon recalling names of 3 boys, Cobble, Hilligest, and Jones, whom he stated he and David had procured for Dean. The police accepted that there was something about the claims, and all 3 of these teenagers were listed as missing, reported missing in the summer of 1971. The other 2 boys had been missing for just 2 weeks. More about this is that the floor of the room where the 3 teenagers were tied and covered in thick plastic sheeting. Police found a plywood torture board measuring about 8 by 3 feet with handcuffs attached by nylon rope at the 2 corners and the nylon ropes to the other 2. Also found at Dean's residence was 2 large hunting knives, rolls of plastic sheeting, which was the same type to use as a cover on the floor, a portable radio rigged to a pair of dry cells to give increased volume, an electric motor with loose wires attached, 8 pairs of handcuffs, a number of dildos, and then there was also thin glass tubes and lengths of rope. So in the driveway was the Ford Ecoline van, and so the rear windows were sealed with opaque blue curtains. This van was covered in soil stains. There was a wooden crate with air holes drilled in the sides. There was pegboard walls in the rear of the van that was rigged with several different rings and hooks. Another crate with air holes was drilled in the side, was found in Dean's backyard. And inside the crates was several strands of human hair. So, yeah, they found a lot of different things. Elmer would accompany police to Dean's boat shed in southwest Houston, where he claimed a lot of the victims would be found. Inside the boat shed, this is when they found a half-stripped stolen car, a child's bike, a large iron drum, water containers, 2 sacks of lime, a large plastic bag of teenage boys' clothing as well. There were 2 prison trustees began digging through the soft, like shell-crusted earth in the boat shed, and they soon would discover the bodies that are wrapped in the clear plastic beneath a layer of lime. So police would continue excavating through the earth of the shed, and they would unearth more remains of these victims. And they would be in various stages of decomposition. Some were shot, others were strangled, some had the ligatures still wrapped around their necks. All of the victims were found to be sodomized. Most of them had evidence of sexual torture. Pubic hairs were plucked out. Their genitalia was chewed. Objects had been inserted into the rectal cavity. Glass rods also had been inserted into their urethra and smashed. Cloth rags were inserted into their mouths, and adhesive tape was on their face to muffle their screams. So the tongue of the first victim uncovered was like protruded over their teeth by about an inch. The mouth of the third victim was also agape. This was unearthed on August 8th. And the upper and lower teeth were visible. This led to the investigators to theorize that he had died screaming. After the recovery of the 8th body from the boat shed was complete. This was completed at 11:55 p.m. that day. The investigation stopped until the next day. So David was accompanied by his father when he presented himself to the Houston Police Department headquarters on the evening of August 8th, and he gave a statement in which he denied any participation in the murders. He did admit to knowing Dean and knowing that Dean had killed and raped 2 youths in 1970. However, on the morning of August 9th, Elmer gave a full written statement detailing him and David's involvement in Dean's crimes.
That kind of left you on a cliffhanger, but this video is so massive to the point where I have to cut it down again. So there will be one final part to this video that will be up right after this one. So I hope you guys enjoyed part 2 of the Dean Corll Candyman Houston mass murders, and there will be part 3 coming soon. Bye.
A million people in the crowd, but I only see your face in all the lights.